Hello and a very warm welcome to everyone. I am Shrija Agrawal and you are watching the second dispatch in our series of thought leadership conversations with Sri Lamarchan Mandudas. We are joined today by Mr. Cyril Shroff, the managing partner at the firm. Also joining him is Amita Katragara, partner at the firm. Amita and Mr. Shroff, thank you for joining us. The topic for today's discussion is a pertinent one, navigating the governance curve. It's an interesting topic as governance has assumed a significant color and importance in the pandemic. These are unprecedented times, to say the least, and especially what a time to be a director of a public company. Weekly huddles via video chat and incomplete information decks that can only be digitally accessed through secure networks. Perhaps gone are the days of scheduled board meeting just once in the quarter with detailed agenda papers that fixedly delivered in advance. In our last conversation with Mr. Shroff, we were actually talking about developing a new skill set for the deal makers to establish trust in synthetic environments. Perhaps there are new realities which the directors at the board of companies also need to be grappled with. While these are one set of new realities, we also have the changing nature of the disclosures. During the pandemic and the recovery, disclosures are likely to become increasingly stakeholder centric. While EESG, which really stands for employee, environmental, social, and governance disclosures, generally have been presented separately with financial disclosures, the pandemic has blurred the line between the two set of issues. In my conversation with a very interesting and a very distinguished panel today for the next 1 hour, we'd like to deep dive into some of these topics. For the purpose of clarity, we have structured the conversation to three parts. The first part really will talk about the current assessment coming out of COVID-19. I will start with you, Mr. Shroff. If given the context of the conversation that I really established, if you could perhaps tell me what is the thinking pattern of board directors right now? Give us some color. How are they thinking through this?
Thank you, Shrija, and pleasure to be back again. I really enjoyed our last interaction as well, and
Absolutely.
once again, I think we are dealing with an extremely important topic, which has long-term implications. Because what we are going through at this moment universally is unprecedented. It's universal in terms of its impact, and it is not possible that the framework of governance that we have seen in the past will not go through a very fundamental change. The entire trajectory of the conversation is about to change. I think the few initial changes of direction have happened, but we will see the impact of the trajectory change become more and more evident as time passes by, and the real impact of this sort of comes to bear. It's like when there is an earthquake under an ocean, it takes a few moments before the tsunami hits the shore. So we are in that interim phase where the earthquake has happened and the tsunami wave is sort of building up, and it will hit the floor with that timeline. We are in that
It's very well put.
period.
Yeah.
That's what I think is happening. So, as you rightly said, we are discussing this in three parts, and I think the best way to start is to talk about firstly what is the current assessment. So, again, without disrespect to any boards, I think it's in three phases. If you were to look at the past, I think boards were largely fast asleep. Then, in the initial phases of the crisis, probably in the March April time frame, they started running around like headless chickens. So they were awake, but they were headless chicken. And what we're seeing now is a gradual awakening. So I think the dust is settling. They've sort of taken stock. So initially it was a bit more of rabbit in the headlights kind of syndrome, but at this point now, the conscientious boards or those who are kind of more thoughtful are finding their feet, and they're grappling with some of the real issues. And they have, I think, created a cascade of priorities as well of how to deal with it. So first and foremost, this is a health crisis. So most boards are first and foremost worried and are taking care of the health and safety of their employees, and also of their supply chain, because it's not just your employees, but every business entity has an implication on a wider sort of ecosystem of both customers and suppliers. So many of the businesses are thinking about the implications on the entire chain. So first, I think the health and safety crisis. The second, I think they're dealing with other forms of risk assessments as well. So given the impact of this crisis on stock market prices and this competitive vulnerabilities, many of them are also thinking about what if I had a hostile takeover, and what about my share price? So even if you see some of the initiatives on relisting or take private, how do you insulate yourself from the change in corporate culture? So that's another sort of survival related governance that is taking. The third relates to raising finance. So I think there's a general common sense mantra of cash is king. So there are 4 or 5 mantras which got, but the one right at the top is cash is king. And therefore, how do you tank up on capital? Do I go to the equity markets with a QIP or a rights issue? Do I draw down on lines of credit? What would be the terms of it? So that's another theme that is occupying the attention of boards. Every board conversation has definitely an element of how do we tank up on cash. The other change which we're seeing in the current context is the fact that there was the earlier distinction between the executive and the non-executive director, or the promoter director and the other directors. Some of these changes are getting blurred. So the word non-executive directions is kind of becoming a bit silent now. So you, instead of, as you in your introductory remarks said, quarterly meetings, around the boardroom with lots of cashew nuts, that I think is
The thing of
moving.
the passe.
Yes, I think it is now much more active interaction. So, directors are wanting Zoom calls like this more often. They are asking the management in terms of sort of what's going on some of the issues that we discussed, and vice versa as well. So both managements and promoters, particularly in companies where they have some element of humility, are actually reaching out to the non-executive directors and using them as a resource and not as the enemy. So, and that is actually working well for them, because many of these directors do come with independent reputations and skill sets. So they are useful as well. This includes nominees of private equity houses as well. So in cases where there are PE investors, the nominee of the PE investor also brings a very interesting skill set and quite often comparative experience from other businesses as well as globally. For example, as companies are thinking of how do I restart and how do we come out of the lockdown and what should be the protocol that should be followed, something as elementary as that. So boards are definitely getting involved. It's not just a decision of the management. I think there is a much broader conversation going on. The other conversation we see going on, it may not be very evident at the board level, but it is definitely there in the promoter level. Sometimes spills over into the board as well.
Mr. Shroff, you be a little louder. To be a little louder, I think. Yeah.
Yeah. So the another conversation that is underway is succession planning, which is not just about sort of personal mortality, but I think there's business continuity as well. So,
do you think the succession planning conversation has restarted during this time more because of what is really happening, what was not really there earlier?
It was there earlier, it got accelerated. It has got accelerated, and there are a few companies which I'm aware of where independent directors are even asking the management of where is that white envelope with the name. If something were to happen to the key person, who is going to succeed. So, is there at least is there a white envelope or not? And these are actually really happening. So this is another, and some of this is a bit invisible, but it's there. And another problem that is taking place, depending on the sector, is what are the opportunities for M&A. I think many companies which are actually more liquid and have good balance sheets are kind of licking their chops in terms of what's going to happen 6 months from now, and are they going to get targets at a substantially repriced and a simpler transactions to finish, so that they could use this actually to consolidate their leadership. So this is not, from some of them, it's not just about survival, but it is about widening the gap between them and their competition. So I'll stop here for now at some of the introductory, dipstick of what is happening at boards, and maybe I can have Amita kind of share a little bit of the policy framework under our Companies Act as well, in terms of how the entire stakeholder model of governance, which was embedded in our system, is now actually coming alive. Amita, over to you.
Thank you, sir, and thank you, Shrija. Complete pleasure to be here and be part of these conversations that you're hosting for us. The big thing that sir has brought out is the fact that there is no ordinary course of business anymore. I mean, that itself, that concept has sort of gone out of the window, and now every decision that you make is almost it is a major decision of whether it is survival or it is not survival. As of last week, it was reported that there were over 5,000 notifications that have come out from the government on this crisis. I mean, 5,000. So every week, boards have to come together to see whether the plan that they had put in place last week is still valid. Is it still valid in some parts? It's not valid in the other parts. So how do you put together a company policy in that kind of a situation? And that is the reality that they are faced with. And it's actually fabulous because most directors have really stepped up to it. There aren't really complaints. Everybody understands that this is a crucial moment and these are things that we will need to resolve. And the biggest issue that we think that boards are grappling with right now is the fact that unlike any other time in history, this is the first time that they're truly grappling with completely conflicting interests amongst the stakeholders.
Can you perhaps expand on that, please, the conflict of interest in stakeholders?
Absolutely. Yeah. So, the big issue that is raging in the international markets now is that there are a number of opinion makers who are coming forward and saying that boards should no longer be making decisions on the basis of what they call shareholder primacy. That is, you make a decision with the intention that you're maximizing profits for the shareholders. So everything that guides the board in how they make their decision is driven by shareholder primacy. What is happening now in the international markets is that people are pushing boards to think wider, to say that this pandemic has shown that creation of wealth outside of societal frameworks is impossible. You will not be able to do it. Therefore, when you make your decisions, you should be actually integrating all of the interests of the relevant stakeholders in order to make that. And it's almost like it sounds very obvious to us, just hearing this, it sounds obvious, but it is a very, very deep-rooted debate that is going on. And I can't say that there is yet a final say on this. I mean, a number of boards are grappling about this world over. India is different. India, back in 2013 itself, has legislated a stakeholder form of governance. So, if you remember the 1956 Act imposed the fiduciary responsibility of directors to be driven by shareholder primacy. So, it was shareholder primacy first, and then through a series of judgments, it sort of evolved to becoming that you had to work in the best interest of the company as a whole. What happened with the 2013 Act is that director duties there was an actual categorization where 5 sets of stakeholders have been identified. They have been placed on par, and the 5 are that you will have to act in the best interests of the company, its members, which is the shareholders, the company's employees, the community, and the protection of the environment. All these 5 are part of how a director needs to make a decision. They need to identify that, okay, how will my decision that I will take now have an impact on each of these stakeholders? If there is any specific adverse impact, is there any way that I can change the decision that I am making? Basis this, I will have to find a balance because there will always be a situation where there may be conflict of interest. I'll give you an example. If I pay out normal salaries to employees, I'm reducing the cash available for profits to shareholders. So, to that extent, it's a direct conflict of interest because every penny I pay to the employee has an impact on what kind of profit I'm going to reduce for the shareholder. And so somewhere you need to be able to bring about a balance. The same thing for environment, it's the same thing for community. There are a number of corporations that have come forward and increased their CSR budgets at this time. They have said that, no, we would like to contribute back to society at this point. So they are, in fact, discharging their duty to community, which is again a statutory responsibility for directors. And this is something that is very unique it is something that directors are aware of, but they never had to actually think about it in the framework that they need to discuss it today. And so
Yeah.
that's what makes this crisis so unique.
Prof, I think I would sort of come to you to sort of what Amita just mentioned. This entire, ascent of stakeholder capitalism. I'm just going through this entire an interesting piece in Harvard Law Journal, and I want to sort of get your views on this. I would like to directly quote up on the piece, which says that it's an interesting conundrum that companies can and will be valued by investors for being good corporate citizens. But societal pressures for companies to adopt quote unquote stakeholder capitalism could be self defeating if it results in enterprises that are hamstrung in their ability to innovate, grow, and create jobs. So, can you perhaps put that in context of India as to what we are seeing in the ascent of the stakeholder capitalism?
Oh, absolutely. And I think Amita laid out the basic framework for this. And this conversation about stakeholder model of capitalism versus the shareholder model of capitalism has been going on for decades. I mean, there has been a lot of philosophical thinking about this in the West, particularly in Europe, for a very long time. But this whole conversation has accelerated rapidly in the last kind of decade and a half. And India took the big leap, probably that it is finally coming alive. The kind of trade-offs that are required to be made when you're trying to inherently balance interests of five different constituencies, which could be fundamentally in conflict, is happening now. So you can think about 2013, where it was kind of embedded and it was just lying on the shelves, and it is now walking out of the shelves and coming alive in a real context, in sort of real boardrooms. And it is happening not just in isolation in the current context. I think there is also an investor angle to it. So investors such as BlackRock and Larry Fink, who are quite legendary on this theme, and he has been driving this conversation with his annual letter that he sends out, reflecting his thinking, has been, and particularly in the last 3-4 years, he sent out some pretty important communication. So that has been very influential in global boards, and as you know, it always trickles down in India as well. So that the ESG theme and now the EESG theme has its origins actually in the markets now, because markets and investors such as BlackRock and Vanguard, State Street and others who are sort of index fund, and they control such a large proportion of market capitalization. Once they start driving that, once they tell you that you're not going to invest in your company unless you have ESG in your agenda, when you come with a fundraising plan in the market and you say, no, where is your ESG profile? Can we have a look at, can we examine it? When you get into things like integrated reporting, which is sort of driven more by the sort of accountability frameworks. When all these conversations start happening together, so these are like different instruments playing, and then you kind of get a symphony out of that. So there is I think, an ESG symphony that is coming alive from the different instruments that were playing in the past.
A great segue into our next sort of topic about the ESG discourse that you said is becoming increasingly mainstream in the conversation between the LPs and private equity investors. In fact, I have heard a lot from investors that that LPs are kind of really pushing for having that ESG element. But let me sort of flip that question to you, Mr. Shroff, is that in the entire thing of clean tech investments, for instance, we saw a lot of greenwashing happening. Do you think perhaps this labeling of ESG just for the heck of it to raise capital can also happen from PE side? Perhaps it could be temptations, and how can one avoid some of those temptations?
That's a great question, and there have been many terms that have been used. Greenwashing. I've also heard the word purpose washing as well. So purpose of the corporation is a big theme as well. So sometimes people just tend to pay lip service to it. Now that being said, I think the market is also smart enough, so there's this thing about you can fool some of the people all of the time, you can fool all of the people some of the time, but you can't fool all of the people all of the time. So that always eventually you get caught. So I think it's now more than a decade since this theme has been there, and the market has found its balance. There are now agencies that actually rate you on. So there's a rating agency that looks at it. There's an Indian proxy advisory service which has also started giving you an ESG score as well. So you take first the solidity of the original idea, and then on the market, what it does is it provides checks and balances for this. So I wouldn't be pessimistic. I think this theme is really here to stay, and this governance conversation. So every few years we have a major governance conversation going on for the last kind of 2.5 decades. But it's like how Bollywood evolved as well. So the classic Bollywood movie had a good guy and a bad guy, and the story was all about how the good guy finally defeats the bad guy. But if you see the trend of Bollywood movies now, there's no clear villain. So what we're seeing now is governance conversation, which is a villainless conversation, and it is more about really about reflecting what the reality of life is. And the reality of life is that we are a very globally interconnected society and civilization. The reality of just look at it that somebody ate a bat in Wuhan not more than 6 months ago, and see what's happening in every nook and cranny, sort of corner of the world. If that is not proof of interconnectedness, then what is? And this is exactly, I think, even how the governance conversation will evolve. I'm not comparing it to a virus, but I think that's how thinking will, the stream of thoughts will flow as well.
So beautifully put. In the world of interconnectedness, there's a villainless kind of, corporate governance conversation we are dealing with. Amita, I sort of come to you as to sort of what Mr. Shroff left with. This entire attitude of wrongful trading, but that also sort of comes into picture because he mentioned that, in the earlier conversation, at least you had one bad guy to pin the blame on. But we are dealing with a new and different world and new realities. So how does one sort of solve for some of those equations then?
So that's the thing, Shrija, that there is so many unknowns in what we're looking at now. You don't even know how long this will last. As compared to any other crisis, you're dealing with a situation where an event has already occurred. It is a one-time event, a plane has crashed, whatever it is. There is a very specific event on the basis of which a crisis develops, and it's past. You're sort of managing the crisis with the main event having occurred already having occurred. What we're dealing with now is that we don't even know whether the major part of the crisis has yet struck us. I mean, we're waiting to see what will happen, and every day, of course, there are as many optimists as there are pessimists in the news, so you don't really know where this is going to end. What that actually raises for directors is things like personal liability that may be attached to decisions that you make in the unknown as it stands today. One of them is that the IBC has a concept where personal liability can be resulted on directors if they defraud a creditor. That is, they take on a loan knowing that they will not be able to pay the creditor. That essentially means that you should have some amount of diligence that has gotten you convinced that you will be able to pay off this loan at the time that you were taking it. In a situation where you don't know when business will restart, you don't know what kind of market you will go back into, you don't know when revenues will actually start coming back in, how do you make that determination? But what you're effectively trying to do is to manage the cash for which you're getting all of these loans that are being confirmed by the government or backstopped by the government. But even within that, there is this concept that if there is no clarity as to whether you go out and take a loan right now, will it result in you having, when somebody is wearing a retrospective lens, 7 months later, that the company has gone completely downhill because many more things have happened in the meantime. Could you have made this determination in advance? So it's not a clear world. It's like driving up it's what they say for macroeconomics. It's like you're driving up a hill where you only have the rear view mirror to guide you. Your windshield is completely covered, and that is the kind of space in which directors are making decisions right now.
Interesting. Mr. Shroff, I come to you. I think you spoke about the ESG disclosures and perhaps people are becoming smart. Purpose washing or greenwashing is perhaps not that happening. So, Mr. Shroff, I want to talk to you about that. So, what remains the future of the corporation? Throw some light there. How should CEOs think about laying out what is the future of the enterprise that they're building on? The pandemic has shown that there's a huge interconnected between, the human capital and the value of the enterprise that you're building for the corporation in that regard. What is your message to, the Tatas or Birlas or Ambanis or building out the organization? Because things have really changed since then.
It's a great question. And first, a short answer to your question. Does the corporation have a future? Absolutely. I think the sort of joint stock corporation has been one of the greatest inventions ever made by humanity. So I think that that fundamental idea still remains, but it has evolved and it will evolve a lot more. A lot more. It will evolve by now converting kind of selfish capitalism in a shareholder model to this broader model. I think purpose will become even more important. And I think there will be a broader impact in terms of how corporations react to how the economy is changing. Look at some of the things that are happening. I think we're seeing deglobalization. I think one more impact we're going to see out of this, which is rise of work from home, is a dramatic increase in the gig economy. How are you going to have governance in a gig economy where your workforce is a distributed workforce and is not in a pyramid model, which is basically the military model of governance, where you have a commander in chief and then you have different layers. And so that has been our default mindset in the past. But what the internet, the sort of latest pandemic and the ability that we are all working, there's not one office now. My office now has 750 offices, which is what has happened. How do you think of governance in that part? And this is happening to corporations as well. So the default design in the mind of businesses in terms of what will be the model of governance will fundamentally change, and it's going to democratize it even more. The social contract between the customer, the enterprise, and the employee, all of that is going to be rewritten. And I think there's a lot of potential in that. I think I would see it as a incredible opportunity for humanity to evolve rather than as a threat. So I think the corporation will remain, it will be redesigned. I think we're going to see new design ideas coming in, and we are probably at the first 1% of that evolution. Give it, I think, going to see in the next decade the entire sort of market structure, the way we think of corporations, will dissolve. Humanity has, I think, been spoiled a bit in the past because they always thought there's a crisis, we go back to the old default. SARS happened, okay, 1 year there was a disruption, back to normal. 9/11 happened, yeah, we went back to normal. Global finance crisis happened, we went back to normal, in fact, we did better than before. This one, I think, is different because this one is more universal. I think it's kind of changed certain fundamental assumptions, but it is also pregnant with the greatest opportunity that we have. So, I just hope that we all kind of survive and are there to see that new tomorrow. But it's an exciting one. So, and I think big changes in governance have to come because how nations deal with each other will change, how businesses deal with society will change. I can think of even on governance, probably will it mean that we will change the structure of the board? Today's board structure is a reflection of the shareholder model of governance. Who's on the board? People who shareholders appoint. But we started talking about the stakeholder model of governance. If the board is a microcosm of interests that are represented by a corporation, one of the changes I think we should expect is that the board itself will become reflective of the stakeholder model of governance, which it isn't today. And that very idea is so profound in terms of its secondary implications, in terms of what will it mean to ownership, what will it mean to accountability. So all these changes will come. And this is going to be a conversation, as I said, we're in the first 1% of that journey.